if you have questions as we go, just let me know. Feel free to interrupt. The talk is called Increasing Spending on Election Infrastructure Causes Administrative Elites to Open More Polling Locations and Increase Voter Turnout. And so this is a project that I did in 2020 around the US election. It includes a field experiment with public administrators and then also has some downstream effects on voters, which I'll talk about. All right, so this is part of a book in progress. So if there's something that you want to hear about that I'm not talking about, please suggest it, because I've written 2 chapters. I actually wrote 2 chapters in the last few weeks, like being here in Italy, while my family is still in the United States, has allowed me to get some writing done on this book. But if there's more you want to hear about, I'd be really interested in any feedback. So this is basically one of the chapters that I'm probably going to try to turn into a paper for an article as well. And the first research question in the paper is, can public officials who administer elections be encouraged to increase voter access with budgetary incentives? And so there's a lot going on here, but just to define some of these terms. So public officials who administer elections, these are public administrators who are charged with the running of elections, right? Things like, where do you open polling locations? Where do you site places for voting? If you have postal voting, how is that done? Where are drop boxes for delivering your ballot and so on? In the United States, this is done at a very local level. I know in most countries it's done at a higher level, but in the US it's a very local, and I'll talk about that, which gives a lot of cases. And then voter access is defined as just making it easier to vote. Is it easier for people to vote, or is it harder for people to vote? So that's the definition. Second question, which I think is a little bit more interesting, is does increasing spending on elections to open more polling places lead to higher voter turnout? And so that's the main question that I'm going to address at the second part of the talk after getting to that elite part. All right, so the outline of the talk, I'm going to give you a brief motivation with an example of the type of public administrator that I'm studying in this paper and in the book. And then I'll give you an argument about voters and local public officials. And then I'm going to give you a little context on the 2020 election. I did a field experiment that involved interventions with these public administrators who run elections in the United States. Like, I think one of the most creative field experiments I've ever done, actually, in my career. My career is going to be all downhill after this project, I think. But maybe we'll see. It was very exciting. And then I have 2 studies. I'm going to present the empirics. This is most of my talk. One is an encouragement study where the local election officials, who are the public administrators, were the subjects in a field experiment, encouraging them to take up some funding for elections. And then study 2 is a causal analysis of opening polling places and if increasing the number of polling locations leads to higher voter turnout. I also have some correlational analyses I'm going to talk about too, and then implications. All right, so here's the motivation. This map down here is the state of Georgia in the United States. Each of these geographic units is a county. This is the lowest level of geographic aggregation that elections are administered in the United States. There's 159 counties in Georgia. There's an election administrator, a public administrator in every single county who decides things like, where do you put polling places? How many hours are polling places open? A lot of discretion but from the public officials within each county on how to open or how to run elections, basically. This is an article, just some historical context. This is a man, his name is Primus King. Georgia has a long history of making it really hard to vote, has a long history of making it really hard to vote, especially for Black people and people who are not white. And this guy sued back in the 1940s to end what was called the white primary, which meant that only white people could vote in the first round primary elections. And this happened in this county right here in red, Muskogee County, Georgia. It's one of the most populated counties outside of the Atlanta area. And then I'm gonna fast forward to the future. 2020, same county, Muskogee County, Georgia. Again, right here in red, it's on the border with Alabama. It has a history of discrimination in voting. It's about 45% Black, 45% white in terms of its racial demographics, but it doubled its election budget due to some grants, and the grants are the interventions that I'm going to talk about. They opened more early voting sites and for more days, and then a 9.2 percentage point turnout increase from 2016 to 2020. So this place that previously had a history of discrimination went from about $600,000 that they usually spend on elections to $1.2 million that they spend on elections in 2020. All right, and so this person right here, her name is Nancy Boren. She is the public administrator. She is the local elite that is an example of the kind of person that I'm studying in this paper. This is her office. She has a picture of Prentice King in her office behind her. She used grant money from 2 private philanthropic sources to open 2 new polling places, and in particular hire a bunch of people who'd been laid off during COVID or furloughed during COVID. And so she sent me this text message that said, we are spreading joy with these grants, and I'm going to talk about the grants in a minute. One of our new poll workers told me I can feed my baby tonight. So not only did she administer elections, she actually hired people to administer elections, and in doing so, basically created a jobs program in her community, which is kind of cool. All right, so going back to the research question, does increasing spending on elections, but I just want to present Nancy as an example, just so you can get in your head, like, who are these elites that I'm studying? But does increasing spending on elections to open more polling places lead to higher voter turnout? And this is my argument. You spend more money on elections, like Nancy Boren did in her county, $600,000 additional dollars of spending will lead to higher turnout. You spend more money, you hire more people to work at the polls, you open polls for longer, you have more polling sites and locations, voter turnout will go up. You increase funding for elections, you have more polling places, and then this is the main argument of my paper. All right, so the theory I'm still working through, to be honest, so I would appreciate any feedback. But when we think about these administrators who administer elections, they face constraints in making allocation choices. And this is hardly ever studied. People don't look at local election administrators very much. They don't look at election administrators very much in any country, US or otherwise. If they have a very limited budget, there's only so much they can do in terms of making it easy to vote. And as I noted before, in the US, elections are administered at the local level. So I'm going to talk about other states beyond Georgia, but there are thousands of public administrators who run elections in every county in the United States, and in some cases, like Massachusetts, in cities. All right, so the theory is, what are the motivations of people like her, of people like Nancy Boren, public administrators? It's what we know from public administration. They want to keep their jobs. They want to keep their principal happy, if we think of them as agents, right? The principal that hires them or potentially fires them is somebody they're going to be thinking about. In these particular places, there's a small legislature that oversees administrators. And so that's, in some ways, they want to make sure they're keeping that board happy or that legislature happy. They're also motivated by public service, right? They went into government. They're not working in business. They're not working in the private sector. So they're not motivated by personal financial motivation as much as they are by public service. And then for some of them, because these are administrators who do elections, are interested in making it easier to vote. And so this is where, if you think about the PA literature, people talk about stewards, public stewards among administrators. These are people who would actually try to do a good job and may be self-motivated to try to enhance administration for the citizenry. And then they want to maximize budgets too. So we know that bureaucrats like to maximize their budgets when possible. And then, I've done some work, and then others, Ariel White and co-authors, behavioral biases may creep in when these are the audit studies that we were talking about this morning. When you look at these local public administrators and you give them an opportunity to help somebody who is a racial or ethnic minority and someone who is not, they more frequently help people who are the majority group. So there's biases that are gonna creep into. And so my argument about the administrators are they agents or are they stewards? And so this literature on agents or stewards basically says some public administrators are stewards. They're not just trying to follow their principal. They're not trying to just do the stuff that we think about in a principal-agent relationship, but they're actually trying to do good for the people who they represent, even though they're not elected. And so in the case of election administrators, what would be a good steward? It'd be trying to increase turnout. It'd be trying to increase voter access. It would be trying to reach black voters and white voters equally. And then some are not, right? And so some are not stewards. Some are actually agents who really don't care about making it easier to vote in the case of public administrators. And so my other argument is the stewards, the administrators who really do care about trying to help the citizenry, will be able to be stewards more easily when their budgets are increased, when they have more discretion, because they have a lot more money they can spend, in this case on elections. They're going to be able to do things to, basically help voters. All right, and then the inverse is the same too. The lower the budget is that's allocated, so if the county legislature doesn't want to have turnout be very high, they should allocate less money. Less money would mean fewer places to vote, less voter access, less voter turnout. So the dollars can make a huge difference on actually affecting voters. Budgets matter. The lower the budget, those local administrators, especially the ones that are stewards who want to help voters, they're just going to have less leeway and discretion to open polling locations. And then the less discretion they have, the more likely there will be harm. So higher budgets, more discretion, stewards will make it easier to vote. Less budgets, less discretion, the bureaucrats will not be able to do much in terms of affecting that. And here's one example now from the state of Texas to help motivate this budget constraint and what administrators can do. So this red county is Cameron County, Texas. It's at the border of Mexico and the United States. And this is a picture of the county that I took from Google Maps. I realized I should have put it in, kilometers, but hey, this is from, it's in miles. But there are two population centers in this county. One is Brownsville. It's a city down here right on the border of Mexico, and another city, Harlingen. And then the actual choice that the administrator, the local elite had to make, who runs elections here, his name is Remy Garza, he had to decide where to open an early voting polling location. And so in his county and in Texas, people can show up before election day to cast their ballots, and he only had enough money to open one. And so he had to put it either here, where a bunch of people live, put it here, where a bunch of people live, or to put it right in the middle, where no one really lives, but then it would be equidistant to the population bases. And so these are, with a budget constraint, to only be able to open one, he has to make choices that will make it harder for people to vote here, or harder for people to vote here, right? He ended up applying for the grants that I'm gonna talk about later, and he was able to open a big early voting place right here and right here. So with budget constraints removed or reduced, you're able to do more. You can have more than one location to vote.
How many miles from one point to the other?
This is 26 miles apart. Yeah, so like 45 kilometers, something like that.
44.
Yeah, 44. Yeah, so really far apart, and that's the thing, right? Like it's a pretty significant distance, and we're talking about, it's a fairly populated county. I think tens of thousands of people in each of these cities, maybe even hundreds of thousands in each of these cities, because it's Texas. So even cities you're not familiar with are large in Texas. But that's the budget constraint, right? Less budget constraint, you can open places to vote everywhere, or more places. More of a budget constraint, you have to really pick some winners and losers. All right, so how does this affect voters? It's pretty straightforward to how it influences voters. I think with administrators, increase the budget, they increase the discretion, especially if they're stewards of the citizenry. But how does it affect voters? Right, the cost of voting is going to be higher when there's fewer places to vote. It's really straightforward. Going 20 some miles to vote is a huge cost to a voter versus just, walking down the street, driving 1 mile, and so on. The difference between 1 versus 4 polling locations is a significant cost. And so if the costs are greater than the expressive benefits, the voter will not vote. Now, there is an alternative view in the literature that I want to point out that's different to my argument. That there's another set of papers, one of them is by Josh Clinton et al. And published last year, that says the same voters participate regardless of how many times you open places to vote or where you open. And it's basically, you open 4 places to vote, the same 10,000 people show up. You open 1 places to vote, 9,500 people show up. You do have a little bit of a reduction potentially, but more or less there's a substitution effect where people who want to vote will find a way to vote, regardless of if there's an infrastructure for voting. And I don't agree with that, but I do want to point out that's a puzzle in the literature. All right, so my hypotheses are counties, geographic units that will have more funding should have higher turnout from the straightforward decision to have more infrastructure for voting should make it easier to vote and more people will vote. Counties with more funding will open more polling places, and that's the mechanism behind higher turnout. I also think the effect size is going to potentially differ between voters of color, so black voters, Latino voters in a place like Texas, and white voters, because it's easier for white voters to participate. And administrators, most of whom are white themselves and have biases in favor of white voters, are going to, when they're budget constrained, they're going to open polling places where white voters live. They're going to be less likely to do so where they're minority voters. If they have a big budget, they can open polling places everywhere, and it'll be more likely to reach minority voters in those cases. And like I said, most people don't find any effect of opening new polling places on turnout. All right, so let me get into the studies. I'm going to start with study 1. This is the one I'm really excited about. It was a randomized field experiment where we encouraged local elected officials to apply for grants to increase their budget for elections. It was truly I'm happy to talk about it in detail. I won't end the presentation about exactly how it came about, but I'll talk about that. And then study 2, I used the randomized encouragement from study 1 to estimate a 2-stage least squares model with an instrumental variable to basically be able to make a causal argument empirically about the increase in polling places on voter participation. All right. In general, there's no research to my knowledge on spending in elections. I've looked almost everywhere. There's one article in the AJPS in 2019 by Moore et al. That looked at as the dependent variable, why counties spend more or less money in North Carolina, one US state, on elections. It's the only paper I'm familiar with in the United States that looks at spending on elections. And then there's one paper in Ghana, Harris 2020, that talks about a change in Ghana in spending at the national level and how that had an impact on increasing polling places and locations in Ghana. But other than these 2 papers, I've not found anything on election spending, though I think it's a pretty critical part of the story of what political elites do in terms of running elections. All right, and then in 2020, there's 2 really what I'm calling audacious programs from private philanthropists to directly fund elections. This is also something that not many scholars have studied. I think some scholars are starting to notice it and pay attention to it. And it's starting to get a little bit of attention in the public in the United States as well. But the biggest program is one by Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg. They're married, and Mark Zuckerberg, of course, is the founder and I believe the CEO of Facebook, of Meta. They gave approximately $350 to $400 million to local county officials across the United States. That was done through a private nonprofit group called CTCL, the Center for Tech and Civic Life. It's a nonprofit that's been around for a while, devoted to educating public administrators who run elections about how to do it better. They've never had $350 to $400 million of funding until the 2020 election. And so this is a pretty significant intervention in American elections that spent money on making it easier to vote. And the CTCL program was on anything. So if you wanted to hire new people to work at the polls, you wanted to open polling places, you wanted to get new things to open the mail-in ballots, whatever it was you needed money for infrastructure-wise, the counties could use their funds to do that. And so that's how some of these counties' budgets increased dramatically. The Georgia county that I started with as an example with Nancy Bourne, she got a $400,000 grant from CTC to do a lot of election administration. And then the one that I'm familiar with that I'm part of is USC, the University of Southern California. I'm the academic director of a center called the Schwarzenegger Institute, when I was a kid, I never would have guessed that this is what I would be doing as an academic. But Arnold Schwarzenegger, when he was no longer governor of California, created the institute at USC to study political and election reform. And we did a grants program in 2020, and he generously gave $2.5 million to USC to basically do a smaller scale program to what Chan Zuckerberg was doing. But our program was just for opening new polling locations. And because it was run through USC, we were able to study it and do the research. And so that's where I come in. To my knowledge, this is the only university-run nonprofit intervention, nonpartisan and nonprofit philanthropic intervention in elections ever in history. So I think that's kind of cool. Probably the only time I'll say. Later I could talk about like how that came about. It was an interesting thing that happened. So what did we do? I'm going to talk mostly about the Schwarzenegger ones because that's what my study is based on. The CTCL ones, the Chan Zuckerberg grants are important too because they spent so much money on election administration. So where were the Schwarzenegger grants done? Just to give you some context, this is a map of U.S. states that were formerly covered by the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. It was ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013. However, we decided to target these states because these are the places that have a history of racial discrimination in terms of polling access. And so this is Arizona, Alaska, Texas, much of the U.S. Southeast, parts of Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. And so every local jurisdiction was eligible to apply for our grants to open polling places in the 2020 election, and but only in these states that are formally covered by the Voting Rights Act. CTCL, Chan Zuckerberg, their grants went to the entire country if people wanted to apply. So the experiment that we did is we randomly called 280 local election administrators. So 280 of the people in each of these eligible places got a cold call on the phone from students, from me, from staff.
Schwarzenegger.
Not from, no. Yes, but not really. So Schwarzenegger called a few people after they received the grants. He called into the county in Texas that I mentioned. He called into the county legislative meeting and announced that the grant was coming.
Carried, so people
But he did not call people to encourage them to apply. He only called once they had applied and accepted the funding. So, but we made the calls, and so what's nice about this is about 1/4 of them were invited. Everyone was eligible. You could apply even if you didn't get the call. So everyone did get an email in advance pre-treatment about it. So it's not that we didn't invite other people, but the phone call was given to 1/4 of the administrators. More background on it. I mentioned some of this already, but just to make sure. So $2.5 million were raised at USC for nonpartisan grants to open polling places and for research. There's a committee that I chaired that reviewed the applications from the counties. We tried to make decisions within 48 hours. We met almost every day in fall 2020. Other faculty and experts on nonpartisan administration reviewed the proposals that came in from the counties, and we tried to fund things within a ratio, a cost to population ratio, so that the amount of dollars that went to every county was approximately per capita similar across counties. It wasn't exactly, because it depends on what the counties requested. And then the committee assessed the reviews and made final decisions, but the most important thing for the study, even with this thorough review, nonpartisan review, all counties that applied who were eligible received funding. So we called people randomly, we encouraged them to apply. If they applied, they got funding. So there's the randomization actually led to an increase in the budget of the administrator. A little bit more of the context, just to give you some things. These are some of the local election officials in different places that received the funds. It went to counties in 8 states. Those counties have 3.5 million voters who live in those counties. More than 200 early voting polling locations were open, and more election day polling locations are open. Not because of the funding that we did entirely, but that was the total amount. But they definitely increased the number of polling places available because of the grants program. And so this one right here is in Phoenix, Arizona, Maricopa County. They used the grant funding to open 8 new early voting polling locations where you could drop off your ballot from your car because of COVID. Other places used it to hire people so that they could open more polling places. And they needed to hire staff to work at the polls because their usual volunteers weren't willing to show up. Okay, in total, between our randomized encouragement, but also through the CTCL program, 323 counties in these former VRA states were funded by either Schwarzenegger and or CTCL. 714 did not apply. All right, so did it matter? Did this help at all?
Were they balanced between Democrats and Republicans currently, so to say?
So you mean in terms of who applied? I'm not sure. So because USC is nonpartisan and the Schwarzenegger University is nonpartisan, for legal reasons, we didn't look at any partisan data for either applicants
And
nor.
you do electoral tracking of the county in the press.
Yeah. Have I tracked them in the past?
Yeah.
No.
I mean, you can know whether the majority was usually Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah, but I'm because of the legal restrictions on that, I'm not doing that. I'll have somebody else do that study. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So this is the question I could ask.
Yeah. No, you can ask it. But,
I don't get the answer.
yeah. But I have not looked at that. My hunch would be there is balance, but I'm not sure. Yeah. For legal reasons, we did not want to consider and were prohibited from considering partisanship in the allocation, and that's why everybody who applied got grants. But yeah, if someone else wants to study that, it'd be a good paper. So the as I mentioned, randomized phone call. The units of analysis here are those public election administrators, people like Nancy Bourne. About 1/4 of them got a phone call, and what are the results? Randomized encouragements cause the local officials to apply for the grants. This is straightforward and is going to be used for the next study. But this is a linear probability model, OLS. The dependent variable is, did the administrator apply for a grant? 0 if they did not. This first model just has the randomized encouragement. So 4 percentage point increase in uptake if we call them on the phone. It's pretty straightforward. It's kind of exciting. You call people and give them free money, they are more likely to apply for free money. It's a little lower than you might guess, given that we were giving away money, right? So if you think about it that way, there are people who don't want to be stewards, don't want to make it easier to vote. When given the opportunity to vote or to open new polling places, they said no. And some people on the phone told us they weren't interested, and they told us why, and we've recorded that too. And there's different reasons, like they said they didn't need the funds, they weren't interested, they didn't want outside interventions, some racial components of some of the comments that came in from some of the administrators on the line. The other thing is when we made the phone call, we asked for the name of the public administrator. We went through the websites, just like you all did for your study, and got the phone numbers and the name of the administrator and asked specifically for that person. If no one answered, we left a message, but we were able to get through to most of the people, and I also recorded that. Did another model with the state of Louisiana. The Secretary of State strongly discouraged its public administrators from applying for these grants. They didn't want to make it easier to vote. So included a dummy variable for Louisiana for robustness. It didn't affect it. And then CTCL did this other program. It's easier to apply for our grant if you've already applied for a previous grant. That's positively correlated with applying for grants. So the takeaway is randomly encouraging administrators to seek additional funding. They seek additional funding. It's a pretty straightforward finding, but I think it's kind of cool. These are reversed. This is me describing this is the model, but then I presented the data already. All right, so the second study, which I think is a little bit more interesting, uses that first encouragement study to model the effect of polling places on turnout. So the second study, I want you to think about the unit of analysis is the county. So it's those individual places like Muskogee County, Georgia, Cameron County, Texas, and so on. And it's every county formerly covered by the Voting Rights Act in this red, or in some cases in the blue as well. The dependent variable is really simple. It's at the aggregate level, at the county level. Percent of people who turned out in 2020 minus the percent of people who turned out in 2016. Do that to try to keep things relatively fixed within that 4-year time period. There are some changes, of course, but that's the dependent variable. Key independent variables: Schwarzenegger Institute funding, yes or no? Chan Zuckerberg funding, yes or no? All right, so these are the results of that, just the descriptive results. And I'll get to the causal part in a second. So counties that applied for and received, every county that applied received Schwarzenegger nonpartisan funding. There's a 6.3 percentage point increase in turnout in 2020. Those that didn't apply and did not receive funding, there's an increase of 4.5 percentage points because it was an exciting election in 2020. People paid attention. The difference in means is 1.8 percentage points, and that's statistically significant. Now, there's other things that could be going on, so I'm going to have a more extensive model soon. And then the CTCL funding, similarly, if Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg donated money to CTCL, who then gave money to the local counties, turnout was up 5.3 percentage points there. Places that did not seek out and did not receive CTCL funding also had an increase, but it was 1 percentage point less.
Are there counties that are both?
Oh yeah, definitely. So we have some that are both, some that are only Schwarzenegger, and then a lot that are only CTCL. What were you thinking there? Like just if the combo of the two together would be higher than just one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I haven't looked at that. I should look at that. But there's some that got none, got one, got two. The other thing I should mention on CTCL, everyone who applied for their program also received funding. So there's no discretion on CTCL's part to give it to some counties and not to others. Everyone who applied received it. All right, so I want to look at this causally. That's great descriptive data, but there's a lot of things that could be happening besides the grants in those counties. Public administrators who seek funding may have a selection bias of trying to do better, right? So the turnout's higher because good people are working there who try to make it easier to vote. The grants and the budget itself didn't make a difference. So here again, the county's the unit of analysis, but I'm going to estimate a two-stage least squares model. Same dependent variable, change in voter turnout. But what I think is really cool is I use that randomized encouragement study 1 to to use as an instrument in the first stage of the two-stage least squares model, where they randomly encourage or not. So if we called someone, that is not correlated with turnout, right? So it's a really good instrument. There's no way calling up a public administrator and encouraging them to apply for funds led to an increase in turnout in 2020. So we have a really nice instrument. And then the instrumental variable is the random encouragement, and then the instrumented variable is the change in polling locations from 2016 to 2020. And so since our program was devoted to spending money to increase the number of places to vote, the random encouragement led to a 4 percentage point uptick in grants. And so that should also lead to an increase in polling locations. And then the increase in polling locations is used to predict the dependent variable in the second equation of change in turnout. This should say minus, it says MinSU, but it's the 2020 polling locations minus 2016. All right, so what are the findings? Using the randomized phone call as an instrument from study 1, and then the instrumented variable of the change in polling locations. It's really straightforward. The average treatment untreated effect, the coefficient is 0.289. To interpret this a little bit more easily, you open 4 new polling places in a locality, turnout increases 1.1 percentage points over 2016. So it's pretty big. We're talking about tens of thousands of people who voted in 2020 that didn't vote in 2016. And I'm pretty confident the cause is the increase in the budget that we gave to those counties. And then again, the budget increased at approximately similar rates in terms of population and proportion within each county. When we allocated the funds as best we could, we tried to give funding proportionally per capita in each county that received funding. So the takeaway is you increase your budget, in this case via private philanthropy, more polling places open, more polling places cause higher turnout. Straightforward to my knowledge. I don't think anyone has found a relationship between budgets causing increased turnout or polling places causing increased turnout in any context. I also did a similar model, but instead of looking at changes in polling places as the instrumented variable, I looked at the spending. So the relationship between spending and the outcome, and it's similar result. There's that. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to talk about is just, you might think, well, how much money matters, right? And so I don't have a causal estimate here because there's no way to look at that. But I did collect data on the amount of money spent through the Schwarzenegger Institute that was expended per capita to each county, and then the amount that was spent by CTCL in each county. And so this is the first model. It's just an OLS model, includes some control variables, covariates, about what might matter. Again, the same dependent variable, change in turnout. So what you can see is the CTCL dollars expended per capita, the more they spent, the higher turnout was in those counties. The change in turnout was higher because this program did not exist in 2016, no private philanthropy. Schwarzenegger Institute, same thing. We had a bigger impact. Our dollars went just to polling places. CTCL went to all sorts of administrative infrastructure and capacity, but statistically significant positive correlation in the dollars spent in each location and turnout change. Because there could be selection effects, people who choose not to apply for these funds might be worse at trying to make it easier to vote, and those who did apply are better. I did a Heckman selection model also, where I first modeled people's choice to apply and then the dollar amount spent. And the results are pretty similar in the selection model too. So the takeaway is, spend more dollars per capita, turnout goes up. And then one thing I found kind of interesting too, also COVID deaths per capita were really negatively correlated with turnout, as you might expect, sort of depressing. All right, so the conclusion is money matters for election administration, the number of polling places matters, but the inverse is important too, and probably what's more likely to occur in a lot of these jurisdictions. If you reduce funding and you cut polling places, it reduces the discretion of the administrators. The administrators have less ability to do anything, and voter participation goes down. Like I said, this is one of the biggest projects I've ever done, especially a field experimental project. 3 US states have banned these grants in 2021. The state legislatures voted to not allow them anymore. North Carolina, which is the state that I'm from originally, is considering a ban, but has not yet passed a ban. So it's the first time my research has ever been banned by a state legislature. But I was going to say I'm excited about that, but it's kind of depressing, actually. But the cool thing is what we did was legal. It just may not be legal anymore if we did it in the future. But I'd be curious also what you're interested in knowing more about, because like I said, I'm writing a book. I'm really interested in trying to figure out who are the types of local elites who don't apply for these things, who doesn't want to increase polling places. A lot of counties chose not to take philanthropic funds. I'm also would like to write, I've done some interviews with some of these administrators, so there's some qualitative stuff I could share that if there's things you just want to know about, it'd be great to get feedback on that. And then, like I said, I'm conducting interviews with some of the local election officials, the other outcome variables you're interested in. I'm also interested in downstream effects, so I want to see, in the elections going on right now this year, even though there's no private funding, it has the capacity and the infrastructure been increased so much in some of these places that the elections are continuing to be better in those places that got funding and that didn't. Then I'm also interested in some normative parts of this too, right? So, I think it was generally a pretty good intervention to increase polling places and increase budgets. But, private funders intervening in elections has some normative negative consequences potentially too. And so I'm thinking about sort of the normative pros and cons of this kind of intervention in elections. So that's it. So thanks everybody.